Let's bring in CBS News Chief White House correspondent Major Garrett, who joins us now from the North Lawn. And Major, there is so much to unpack from this New York Times interview, but let's begin with those comments about the Attorney General Jeff Sessions. What are the implications for this sort of public rebuke from the president?
They could be dire. Jeff Sessions, the Attorney General, may have to ask himself some very difficult questions about his longevity in this job and if he can carry out the role of Attorney General independently and consistent with the Constitution, which is what he testified he would do during his confirmation hearings, if he doesn't have the baseline support and trust and admiration of the President of the United States. Now, there are those who look at this situation and say it is not uncommon for President Trump to blow off steam and to criticize people who are close to him in public and to essentially take them verbally to the woodshed. It doesn't mean he dislikes you, doesn't mean you're permanently in the woodshed. It just means he's blowing off steam. And it is quite possible the Attorney General could view it in that light and say it's one day in the life of a turbulent presidency. There have been many before, there will probably be many after, and I'll just ride this one out. Or it could create a more profound sense of self. And what is my mission as Attorney General, and can I carry it out faithfully with this president so conspicuously criticizing me and doing so publicly? Only Jeff Sessions knows the answer to that, but we are at least going to get, I think, some insight into his demeanor in about an hour, because on an unrelated matter dealing with cybersecurity, Jeff Sessions is due to have a press conference here in Washington, D.C. So we'll get some sense of the way he's interpreting this. But there are those in the Justice Department who might see this as whatever it means to the personal relationship between the President and the Attorney General, and whatever it means for the Attorney General's longevity in that post. There are those in the Justice Department who may interpret it as yet again another reminder that this president has a problem with the independence of that very same Justice Department. And when it acts independently or consistent with what it believes the law requires or propriety directs, he doesn't like it. And he talks about it publicly. That could create its own sense of, well, maybe continue the sense of melodrama in the Justice Department that has been part and parcel of the Trump presidency almost from the beginning.
He also mentions in that interview what he considers to be a red line for special counsel Robert Mueller, and that is if the investigation was to stray into the Trump family's financial dealings not connected to the Russia investigation. To be fair, he was sort of asked that question, not necessarily leading, but it was certainly presented that way. Would this be a red line for you? And he said it would. Do you find that relevant?
Of course it's relevant in the sense that it is the president saying, if there is something that happens with this investigation that I think is incorrect or unfair, I might do something about it. It creates the idea, at least the suggestion, that if Robert Mueller strays from what the president believes the investigation is about, which he said is Russia, it's possible the president could order his Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, to fire Robert Mueller, the special counsel. Now, that's many, many, many steps down the road. And as you accurately point out, Anne-Marie, the president didn't bring this up. He wasn't driving into this conversation saying, hey, let me tell you what I think the red lines are for Robert Mueller, the special counsel. It was in a question and answer, and only upon answering did the president at least create this possibility. But with a president who's fired the FBI director, James Comey, over the Russia investigation, those are his words, and fired the acting Attorney General, Sally Yates, because he disagreed with her on a particular point of law, the president's penchant for lashing out at those in high government positions because he disagrees with them is well established. So it's worth reminding ourselves that at least in this context, the president has left himself open to that possibility should he conclude Robert Mueller is off the Russia investigation into areas the president finds disagreeable.
Major, there was something else that was fascinating in this interview with the New York Times. The president suggesting that the former head of the FBI, James Comey, in presenting to President Trump information that was out there that members of the media were starting to report on, which is that dossier about Mr. Trump's activities in Russia, that the president seemed to indicate or imply that Director Comey was somehow trying to hold it over his head. What do you make of that? What are the implications of that? I know Mr. Comey hasn't commented on that, but it does suggest that the president seems to think that he was being almost blackmailed by the director.
So what I probably should have said at the beginning of this, I urge everyone in our audience, go to the New York Times website, read the entire interview. There's a great deal of content in there. Make determinations for yourself. But you raise an important point here, Vlad. Two things the president said about James Comey. One, the dossier, which you very neatly summarized. Another thing he said that I think is worth pointing out, and I'll get back to the dossier in a moment. He also said that James Comey's testimony before the Senate was full of lies, and that they never had a one-on-one encounter at the White House, as Comey testified that they did in February. You famously remember, or you may remember, Comey's somewhat famous testimony saying he was uncomfortable being placed in a one-on-one encounter with the president and hoped the Attorney General would hang there with him, and did not, and was displeased about that. The president denies that one-on-one encounter ever occurred, so there's a rather public disagreement about that fundamental fact, point one. Getting back to the dossier, the president suggested there was a little bit of J. Edgar Hoover in James Comey. J. Edgar Hoover was the long-running original FBI director who made it quite a career practice of his to accumulate potentially damaging, embarrassing, or compromising information on very prominent politicians in Washington, and then using that against them to not only create a lifelong career as head of the FBI, but to increase the budget and the wherewithal of the FBI as a law enforcement agency. And there was a suggestion from the president that Comey was raising this dossier as sort of a bargaining chip against him, to say, I have this, so you better be careful. Again, we have no comment from Comey on that, but it does indicate, at minimum, what the perception of the president was about this conversation, and that he's willing to state it publicly to the New York Times does carry it to a higher level of visibility, though it may not carry it to a higher level of credibility until we hear from Comey himself.
You know, the thing about it, Major, is that though we haven't heard from Comey, when he testified, he said that that was a concern of his, that he would come off like that, and that he wanted to make it clear to the president that he just wanted to let him know this dossier is out there. It's probably going to hit the papers. Just want to let you know. And he specifically said he didn't want to make it appear as if he was holding it over the president's head.
Right. And this presentation of his interpretation by the president may be part of what's been a pretty consistent pattern here at the White House and by the president's allies in the world of politics, to raise as many questions about Comey's actions, motives, and credibility as they can, fearing that Robert Mueller's investigation will come dangerously close to the president and those around him on this whole Russia matter. And so it's part of a long-running, not too subtle effort to devalue the credibility of Comey and, by extension, Mueller. The two are very close and have a long association professionally. That may be a part of this. But you're right, Anne-Marie. When Comey testified, he said, of course I feared the president might interpret it this way, and I went out of my way. Those aren't exactly his words. Don't think I'm trying to quote him directly here. I'm doing it all from memory. But the implication was, I know this is dangerous terrain, but I feel duty-bound to at least give the president-elect a heads up about this dossier, because it's something that has at least become something the intelligence community and the FBI is aware of. And if we're aware of it, you should be aware of it so you can deal with it in whatever way you wish. That's how Comey said he presented it during his testimony. Again, we've heard nothing since the president talked to the New York Times to offer perhaps an update or a repetition of that testimony from Comey.
Yeah. Major Garrett at the White House, thank you so much, Major.
Sure.